So I'll be presenting on the social and psychological factors connected with gambling addiction. So first, to start the study, I'll need to define what gambling addiction is. And the National Council on Problem Gambling defines gambling addiction as gambling behavior that is damaging to a person or their family, often disrupting their daily life and career. But gambling addiction is kind of a blanket term that covers like 4 different degrees or severity of gambling. So the first one is non-problem gambling, and that's the least severe. So that basically is a person who doesn't really gamble at all. They might gamble like occasionally one time with friends, but they really have no attachment to it and it's not harming their life in any type of way. And next we have a low risk problem gambler. And this is somewhat similar to the not problem gambler where they're not being harmed by their gambling, but the only difference is that they just might gamble more frequently. So the next most severe is a moderate risk gambler, and this is where it starts to get in the territory where it might start to impact their lives. They're not going into debt, they're not becoming depressive over it, but they are gambling pretty frequently, and they may start to feel down when they lose. The most severe, and the one that people usually are talking about when they use the term gambling addiction, is problem gambling. Problem gambling is when a person's life is being severely damaged. Like the National Council of Problem Gambling says, it's affecting their family, it's affecting their career, and basically every aspect of their life. So what's missing in the current landscape of gambling addiction research, and what will I be addressing? Well, there are studies that test personality traits and mental health and their correlation with gambling addiction, which is what I'm trying to do. But the gap that I will address is that I'm testing exclusively adolescents, specifically high schoolers, which no other study has done. So what's the problem here? Well, 29% of adolescents exhibit one of the dangerous degrees of gambling addiction, that is moderate risk gambling addiction or problem gambling addiction, where it has an impact on their life. This is especially perilous because these adolescents don't understand the risks of gambling. When they make a bet, they don't have the foresight to understand the risk they're putting and the addiction they could be subjecting themselves to. And then 83% of gamblers have lost money. They're in the red overall. So adolescents could be getting themselves into a dangerous addiction that'll cause them to lose money permanently and can severely damage their lives. As for my research question, I'm asking what specific social and psychological factors are correlated with an increased livelihood of adolescents developing addictive gambling behaviors. And that takes me to my literature review. So the first facet I'll be testing with gambling addiction is how gambling addiction relates to other addictions. So a study from Stephen Weiss found that 43% of college students who are addicted to gambling were addicted to other things like drugs, nicotine, vapes, things of that nature. And a study from Wang found that there's a strong correlation between internet addiction and gambling addiction. So the synthesis between these 2 studies shows that people who are addicted to gambling frequently are addicted to other things. It's people who have addictive personalities. They don't just especially enjoy gambling. So the next facet I'll be testing is gambling addiction and personality. So studies from Ferguson and Brunberg identified neuroticism and stress as 2 similar but potential predictors. So people who are stressed in their lives might look to gambling as a form of escapism. They see it as something that could take their mind off lives, that could provide them some sort of excitement and solace from their stresses. And then conscientiousness is a possible preventive factor. So conscientiousness is when a person thinks about the consequences of their actions and how that could affect them long term. So naturally, this will deter them from gambling, as gambling has been shown when it becomes addictive, that it can have negative impacts on your lives. And I'll also be testing gambling addiction and its connection with mental health. So again, Ferguson found that both depression and anxiety can be predictors. And again, just like neuroticism and stress, this has to do with escapism. So people find that gambling is a way to run away from their problems, to escape them, ignore them, and it provides them a certain sort of excitement and dopamine that helps them cope with their depression and anxiety. But the research is not completely one-sided here. A study from SAGO argued that depression and anxiety aren't strong predictors of gambling addiction. They're just things that influence people to act in ways that may be like unwise. They might be addicted to other things. So it's not something that just leads you to gambling addiction. It can lead you to many type of addictions. As for the method I'll be doing, I considered numerous methods. The first one was a meta-analysis, but I decided it wasn't viable because there wasn't enough data on adolescents. As I stated earlier in my gap, there's plenty of data on the personality traits of adults and their connection with gambling addiction, but with adolescents, there's essentially no data. So what I decided to do was an anonymous survey based on the Problem Gambling Severity Index. And the Problem Gambling Severity Index is a survey created by Ferris and Wynn, two researchers in 2001. They created a survey that can test your gambling addiction between those 4 degrees of gambling I talked about earlier. So it's a 9-question survey that includes questions like, have you ever borrowed money to gamble? Do you ever feel bad after gambling? And then the Problem Gambling Severity Index has been confirmed as the most reliable tester of gambling addiction by third-party studies. And my survey will also include questions to test people's personality on a 5-point Likert scale. So I'll ask questions like, would you consider yourself a person who has a lot of stress in your life? And they'll rate it from 1 to 5. And I'll do this about all the factors I talked about in my literature review. As for how I'll be analyzing my data, I'll be utilizing a Pearson-R's correlation coefficient. A Pearson-R correlation coefficient is when you take 2 variables and you try to mathematically show some type of connection on a scale from -1 to 1 on how connected they are. I use this because it has been verified not only as the best method for correlation research, but also it's been used for other similar studies that are correlating gambling addiction and personality traits as well as mental health. And the 2 variables I'll be testing for my Pearson-R correlation coefficient are the composite PGSI score, and the people's answers to the personality questions. And I'll be able to do this because both are being asked on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. So this will allow me to mathematically calculate easily the R correlation coefficient. And I chose these 2 variables because the composite PGI score displays the gambling addiction, and the personality questions display their personality traits, so that will allow me to show the connection between the gambling addiction and social and psychological factors. So here are my results, the R values that I found. Other addictions had a strong correlation with an R value of 0.6224. Stress had a very weak, almost non-existent correlation with an R value of 0.0342. Conscientiousness had a weak negative correlation with -0.3313. Depression had a weak positive correlation with an R value of 0.2078. Anxiety had a weak positive correlation with a R value of 0.2360. Impulsivity had a slightly negative, almost no correlation, R value of -0.0809. And then anger, similarly, had a very small R value, almost no correlation, -0.0383. So how do these results compare to the general research? Well, as for my results on other addiction, where I found that it was strongly correlated, this does confirm what the current literature says. As I talked about earlier, the current literature is very strong in saying that people who are addicted to people who have other addictions are very, very likely to also be addicted to gambling. And one reason for this comes from the National Institute of Drug Administration, and they claim that there's a genome that can cause people to have more addictive personalities and get addicted to things more easily. So this is one reason why people can get addicted to things like multiple things more easily, whereas some people may not get addicted to anything at all. And then as for how my results on anxiety and depression correlated with the current research, it's somewhat mixed, where I had a weak correlation, and the research is a little bit conflicted on what they think about these 2 as predictors of gambling addiction. So I would say my weak correlation was accurate with the current landscape of research, because the current landscape of research has kind of a weak consensus that anxiety and depression are predictors, but they're not like especially strong because they can also be predictors of many other addiction. And then, as I addressed earlier, this is likely because of escapism. People have problems in their lives. For my surveillance, it's likely school, maybe family problems, relationships, and they look to gambling as a way of solace and excitement that can take them away from their problems. And I also looked at how stress and anger relate to the current landscape of research, and both were very weak correlations, almost non-existent, which does not confirm what the current research says, where the current research was largely, had a large consensus that both of these were predictors of gambling addiction, that someone who's more stressed and felt a lot of anger in their life would be more likely to be addicted to gambling. And I believe one reason for this disparity is that my sample population was very different. I sampled high school students, and the studies I'm comparing them to sampled adults. High school students have very different reasons for why they're stressed and angry to adults, which could cause them to deal with it in different ways. And then another factor I looked at was conscientiousness. Conscientiousness had a weakly negative correlation, and this somewhat connects with the literature, as the literature sees conscientiousness as a strong predictor of someone who can avoid gambling addiction. Higher conscientiousness usually causes teens to think about what consequences could come of their actions, so naturally it prevents them from doing things like getting addicted to gambling, as they understand the dangers that come with repeatedly gambling. So as for the limitations of my study, my sample size was quite small. It was only 178 surveillants. Similar studies had around 250 to 400. My goal was to get around 250. But as I tried to reach out to more students and teachers to distribute my survey, I plateaued around 170. And my personality questionnaire may have been flawed because it tests a person's perception of their personality and not how their actual personality is. And I could have tried to avoid this by interviewing people's families or friends to see how their personality is, but this would have been very difficult to do with 178 participants. And I don't think it would create a very big disparity in results, because a study from Connolly claimed that our perception of our personality is generally quite accurate when we're not talking about like our openness to different things, which none of my personality questions tested. So what are some future implications and studies that could be drawn from my study? Well, further research could test how the factors that I decided were predictors can be limited. So they can look at how we can limit things like addiction in adolescence or depression and anxiety, which could address the root cause of gambling addiction and prevent more adolescents from getting addicted. Further research could also test specifically the interplay of other addictions with gambling addiction, and test how to prevent multiple addictions. As I talked about earlier, there's a genome that can lead people to be addicted to multiple things and have more addictive personalities. So further research can test how this could be addressed. And finally, I'd like to review some of my previous claims to conclude this. So the literature review displayed the interplay between different personality traits and mental health with gambling addiction. So display that stress, anger, conscientiousness, depression, anxiety, and other addiction, how they related to gambling addiction. My results showed which factors were actually predictors of gambling addiction, and then in my discussion, I showcased reasons for why and how it relates to the current literature, as well as further implications for later research. Thank you, that's it.
Fantastic. And you have a bibliography slide, good. You were at 14